What did a battalion commander need to do to be awarded a Victoria Cross in the Second World War? We look at the actions of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson, the CO of the 2nd 19th Battalion, and what he did as a part of the withdrawal from Bakri. Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be the third of our leadership podcasts that we're taking from Malaya. So we've looked at the 2nd 30th under Galligan. We've looked at Lieutenant McCure of the 4th Anti-Tank and the work that he did with the 2nd 29th under their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Robertson. And now we're going to look at the CO of the 2nd 19th, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson. And this is truly an amazing story. I think that there is a lot that we can learn from this story because Anderson is placed in a position that I think is really impossible to fathom. He is left in a very precarious situation with no good alternatives, and it is really only his leadership that gets his soldiers through the encounter that we're going to be looking at. So before we get to the fighting at Bakri, who was Lieutenant Colonel Anderson? So, Charles Groves Wright Anderson, he was born in South Africa in 1897. From Cape Town, he went to England as a child, spent a bit of time there, came back to Kenya for World War I. He was commissioned in 1916 as a lieutenant in the King's African Rifles, and he fought against the Askaris of the German colonial forces. He was promoted to captain and awarded the Military Cross for his actions. He stayed in the South African militia until 1934, when he moved to Australia. Him and his wife bought a farming property in Young in New South Wales. He joined the Citizens Military Force in 1939 as a captain in the 56th Infantry Battalion, and in June 1940 he volunteered for the 2nd AIF. He was promoted to Major, and he served in the role as the Battalion 2IC of the 2nd 19th Battalion. In August, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and takes command of the 2nd 19th after Lieutenant Colonel Maxwell is promoted to be the Brigade Commander of 27th Brigade. The 2nd 19th was a part of the 22nd Brigade, so Anderson was serving under Brigadier Taylor. 2nd 19th deploys to Malaya in February of 1941, so they're some of the first Australian troops to be in country. And Anderson, with his experience in jungle warfare from his time in Africa, he is responsible for the battalion's training. So the battalion commander at the time was still Maxwell, and the interesting thing about Maxwell is that he served in the AIF in World War I. He'd been promoted to the rank of captain. In 1919, he was discharged, permanently unfit with recurrent rheumatism. He then went to study medicine, and he actually served in the army in the medical corps starting in 1929. And in 1939, he was the RMO, or the Regimental Medical Officer, of the 56th Battalion. So he had very little contemporary military experience as far as battalion command was concerned. And he actually left a lot of the training to Anderson. He leveraged the experience that Anderson had. Now, the sources that I'm using for this podcast are, once again, Malaya by Farrell and Pratton. That's pretty much the go-to textbook for this. The definitive work, which is Farrell's The Defence and Fall of Singapore, 1940 to 1942. There's a wealth of information in that. And, of course, Pratton's Australian Battalion Commanders of the Second World War. This is a really important book which everyone should be reading because it really does highlight the warts and all pictures of the problems that battalion commanders have and what worked and what didn't as they were moulding the battalions into what they wanted or what they needed to be able to achieve their missions. And delving into these texts, we get a kind of an idea of what Anderson was like. He was described as a hard, practical man, compassionate, respectful, and consultative. And the interesting thing that Pratton talks about is the way that battalions took on a kind of persona which generally came from their first CO and that often carried through to subsequent COs. Maxwell, not having a lot of military experience, contemporary military experience, tended to have a very consultative approach. He didn't issue firm orders. He would issue guidelines, and he relied on the experience of the company commanders and the other officers in their headquarters around him. And once he was promoted to temporary brigade commander of the 27th, Anderson took over from him and continued on with that approach. The commander of the 8th Division, Bennett, he viewed the 2nd 19th to be slow to act because there was too much consultation. And this had started with Maxwell, and he thought that it was carried on by Anderson. He described him as a bit theoretical and discussive. And he thought that in the 2nd 19th there was too much thinking and not enough action. I'll put a couple of pictures of Anderson in the show notes. He looks quite bookish. He looks kind of like an accountant. He was short-sighted and wore glasses. He had a terrible cough. He was a chain smoker. And he's described as having a gentle, whimsical sense of humour. But during the training of the battalion, he placed a really heavy emphasis on aggression, particularly the employment of the bayonet. And he wanted his men to think that he was always going to be in the thick of the action. He carried grenades on his person at all times. So he is a trusted and respected CO for the 2nd 19th. So in setting the scene, the ambush at Gamas occurred on the 14th of January, so the 2nd 30th. After that, they moved to a defensive position a couple of kilometres east, forward of Batu Anam and 5 kilometres east of Gamas. The 45th Indian Brigade, which is composed of the 4th 9th Jats, 5th 18th Royal Gwal Rifles, and the 7th 6th Rajputana Rifles, they're defending Muir, which is on the west coast and southwest of Segamat. The Japanese are pushing them quite relentlessly. Brigadier Duncan refuses requests for withdrawal. He isn't really understanding the full scope of the Japanese advance. What he does do, though, is he asks Bennett for an Australian company to reinforce his position. And on the 17th, Bennett orders Robertson forward to Bakri. And it's interesting because Bennett doesn't trust Robertson. He's sending him out with an understrength battalion to meet the most dire threat that he is currently facing, and he's sending them too late to actually be of any use. Bennett and Percival decide to reinforce the 2nd 29th with the 2nd 19th under Anderson. So they're going to be relieved with a battalion from the 53rd British Brigade. They've only been in country for 4 days, having been on the sea for 11 weeks. What kind of condition do you think they're in, especially when they're going to be confronting well-experienced Japanese troops? Percival's worried about the east coast as well, so the 2nd, 18th and 20th are retained to defend that area. So the situation is that you've got the Japanese in the area pushing down on 2 lines of advance out of Muir. They're coming out in an easterly direction towards Bakri, and they're also moving southeast along the coast road. And the problems for the Allies is that there are numerous trunk roads along here. On the 17th, the 2nd 29th links up with Brigadier Duncan, and he plans a counterattack in an attempt to retake Muir. The Gawalis are attacked as they debus at about 1940 with light machine guns and mortars, and they are scattered. So his counterattack is stopped virtually before it even starts. The next morning, the 18th, this is when the 2nd 29th is attacked on the Muir-Parit Sulong Road, and the gunners from the 4th Anti-Tank do their work. And so they're engaged about 2.5 kilometres forward of Bakri, or to the west of Bakri. Now, it's Brigadier Duncan's intent to get his battalions back together and then possibly to counterattack. So the 2nd 19th is to hold the ground at Bakri. There's a crossroad there. So the road from Muir to Parit Sulong, and there's a bridge at Parit Sulong, and that's what the 2nd 19th gave up to the 53rd British Brigade. So they've moved forward along this road. They're now going to hold the T-junction at Bakri. So running east-west, you've got the road from Bakri into Muir, and to the southwest, you've got a road that runs to Parit Jawa. Down that road, you've got the Rajput and the Gawali battalions. They're about 3 kilometres south of there. The Jats, well, we don't know where the Jats are. They're somewhere to the north along that road. So the 2nd 19th, and as well as that, you've got the 2nd 29th just forward of Bakri as well. So the 2nd 19th is holding a very critical location for Brigadier Duncan to be able to get his troops out. Anderson leaves his A echelon transport in a harbour about 3 kilometres back along the road. As the Japanese were extremely good at doing, they'd actually cut the road between the 2nd 29th and the 2nd 19th. So Alpha Company, 2nd 29th, they had tried to push through and to clear the road. That attack had failed. Charlie Company of the 2nd 19th, supported with mortars and Bren gun carrier and a couple of armoured cars from the 45th Indian Brigade, they were successful. And having opened the road, they were able to move through some food, ammunition, and a wireless truck to be sent through. Now, this is on the 18th. The night was relatively quiet for the 2nd, 19th, and 29th, but there were a couple of attacks, and these were beaten back with the bayonet and grenades, and that was because previous incidents of friendly fire had led to an order being given that there was to be no small arms fire at night. It gives you an indication of the command and control issues that the troops were facing. And I wonder if it was a lack of familiarity with night fighting that led to that. Now, on the 18th, communication had been re-established with the Jats, and they were ordered to link up with the rest of the brigade on the 19th. Anderson was to move Alpha through the 2nd 29th to assist the Jats to link up with the brigade. But unfortunately, the Japanese arrived at the 2nd 19th's defensive position, and they attacked the area that Alpha Company had just vacated. It was currently being held by a section of carriers. The Japanese attacked, they pushed the carriers off the ridge line that they'd been on, and Alpha was ordered to attack the Japanese. One platoon attacked straight into the front of the attacking Japanese. One went around on its right flank, while Bravo Company was moved to attack the rear of the Japanese position. Bravo attacked with fixed bayonets. Another platoon was committed on the right flank, and one of the platoon commanders later wrote that the Japanese were literally running around in circles, being surrounded on 3 sides. The attack destroyed a company, but it only brought a temporary pause in the Japanese advance. This was only a minor setback though. For the Japanese, the ferocity of the attack had focused the Australians' attention on the battle for the ridge line, and as this battle was raging, the AESH position further back down the road was also being attacked. Tsuji stated that because the violence of the frontal attack completely absorbed the attention of the enemy, the Okagi Battalion was able to penetrate through the jungle across the line of retreat. Now, Alpha Company was meant to be out there helping the Jats to regain the brigade position. They'd actually received their orders to withdraw at 13:30 on the 18th, but they moved very slowly against only light opposition. They decided after dark to sit out and wait until midnight, but then they decided that it was too difficult to withdraw at night time, so they decided to wait until daylight. This gave the Japanese all of the time that they needed. The Jats' war diary tells a fairly depressing story. The battalion passed through the AIF position, so that would have been the 2nd 29th, astride the road Bakri Muir at about 1200 hours. Heavy automatic fire was heard in the direction of Bakri. The battalion advanced along the east side of the road, but came into a heavy automatic fire ambush. The enemy fire positions were concealed in swamp on the east side and jungle on the west. It was impossible for the battalion to deploy, and equally impossible to bring covering fire to bear from the rear. As the forward elements of the battalion were halted and suffering heavy casualties, OC Alpha Company decided to withdraw the rear half of the battalion in order to advance along a known track through the swamp in order to outflank the enemy. While reorging the remnants of the battalion, the enemy brought down very heavy and very accurate artillery concentrations. Now, this killed the CO and dispersed the unit, and only 200 of their troops were able to gain the Australian positions later in the day. To make matters worse, the Japanese 3rd Air Brigade starts to make its presence felt. It conducts an airstrike on the 45th Indian Brigade's headquarters. Brigadier Duncan suffers a slight abrasion on the nose, but he is shocked so badly that the brigade major requests that Anderson take command of the brigade. Not only that, the brigade signal section is killed, along with most of the staff of the brigade headquarters, and this included Major Julius, who was the battery commander of 65 Battery. So later in the day, Anderson receives orders to withdraw to Yongpeng, and he issues orders out to the 2nd 29th that they're to fall back on Bakri. They'd been engaged a couple of times during the afternoon, but they fell back in good order at around 1800. 65 Battery provided a prearranged barrage that enabled them to make a clean break. Along the road, however, there were numerous contacts with the Japanese, and only 197 of the troops of the 2nd 29th made it back into the 2nd 19th position. This happened at around 2100. Another group became isolated and they moved independently to Yongpeng. The road was blocked for the carriers and the guns of the 2nd 29th, so they were made unusable and abandoned. Anderson held Charlie Company forward of Bakri until 2300, hoping to bring in as many troops as possible. So Anderson's objective, well, his first objective, was Parit Sulong, and there's a bridge across the Simpang Kiri River. It's 24 kilometres southeast of the Bakri junction that he'd been holding. The road that they were going to be taking had jungle and rubber plantations on either side, intermingled with large swamps, which had the effect of making the road into a long causeway. And a few kilometres short of Parit Sulong was the longest section of the causeway. This worried Anderson because they were going to be at the greatest risk of Japanese air attack whilst on the causeway, and he was hoping that they would be able to cross that in the evening under the cover of darkness. The 2nd 19th led out, Bren gun carriers behind the Vanguard Company. The Indians were providing flank protection, and the rearguard was formed by Bravo Company 2nd 29th, the anti-tank guns, and the armoured cars of the 45th Indian Brigade. Now, because of the requirement to have infantry protecting the transport, the column was moving at walking pace, so they were moving at around 3 kilometres an hour. They moved out at 0700, and it wasn't long before they met the first Japanese roadblock, and that was at 0800. And they'd only gone 1.5 kilometres. There was a company of Japanese dug in on either side of the road, and they delayed the column for 4 hours. The infantry put in a couple of attacks. Both of these were pushed back by the Japanese. Anderson then used his gun carriers. This was also unsuccessful. To make matters worse, you've got the column bunching up now, providing a much better target for air and artillery. Now we start to see the fighting leadership that Anderson was to provide for the convoy. He was well forward during all of the fighting, and he provided the final push to clear the roadblock. He single-handedly destroyed 2 machine gun positions with grenades, and he shot 2 Japanese with his revolver. This inspired a nearby section from the 2nd 19th to rise and follow him with bayonets fixed. An excellent example of the effect that strong leadership can have on young soldiers in turbulent times was written in the diaries of one of the soldiers. And after being rallied by an unsuccessful attack on the Japanese, he recalled that his CO's calm, clear voice gave us a new confidence, and that his own private fears abated. The column was back on the move at around 11:45, and they shortly came to the area where the AESH vehicles had been stored. And burnt vehicles, dead bodies all over the place told the story of what had happened there. They then encountered 2 further companies of Japanese infantry who had put multiple roadblocks on the road. These were covered with machine guns, snipers, mortars, making it difficult for the troops to clear the roadblocks under fire. Anderson was everywhere, coordinating each of the attacks. One Japanese attack took 4 of the vehicles, and threatened to cave in a position that was held by the Jats. Brigadier Duncan got out of one of the vehicles that the wounded were in and personally led a counterattack. He was killed in this counterattack, but they were able to regain those vehicles. While this was happening at the front of the column, the rearguard were fighting desperate battles to keep the Japanese from breaking through. And 65 Battery was firing in the direct fire role to support the infantry. At 17:30, the column had been compressed to the length of just 750 metres, and the situation was becoming desperate. The second 19th War Diary describes it best. The action brought into distinction the superlative initiative of Australian troops. Every man was fighting mad. Mortar shells were directed onto the targets by infantrymen a few yards from the target. Gunners were fighting with rifles, bayonets and axes. A gun crew pushed a 25-pounder round a cutting and blew out the first roadblock vehicles at 75 yards range. Carriers pushed to within 5 yards of Jap MGs and blew them out. 2 carriers almost cut the walls of a 4-inch walled concrete house to pieces with Vickers. Houses contained 3 Jap MGs and around 60 men. Men went forward under heavy MG fire and chopped roadblocks to pieces with axes. At 18:30, the Japs had had enough and cleared out, leaving hundreds of casualties. There was no time to rest. The convoy needed to move out to be able to move across the causeway under the cover of darkness. They soon met up with a platoon that formed the remnants of the AESH of the 2nd 19th's support elements. 2 riders were sent forward to scout the bridge at Parit Sulong. They returned and said that they'd been challenged by 4 sentries in a foreign language. Anderson sent out a patrol at 0400, which confirmed that the bridge was held by the Japanese. The platoon that had been with the AESH had been holding the bridge at Parit Sulong. They'd been relieved by a platoon from the 6th Battalion Norfolk Regiment, part of the 53rd British Brigade. So remember, they've only been in country a few days, less than a week. The platoon from the Norfolks, they feared that they'd been cut off from their battalion, and so they had abandoned the bridge earlier that afternoon. Tragically, this was only one of the significant roadblocks that still was in front of Anderson and the column. The road to Yongpeng went through a defile at Bukit Pelendok, and the 53rd Brigade was tasked with holding that. The Japanese had pushed them off the hills surrounding the defile. So this left Anderson with the problem of how was he going to clear the bridge. He didn't attack during the night, and this is one of the questions about the retreat. Why did he not try to force the bridge when he had the cover of a very dark night that night? And there's probably a few really good reasons. Firstly, the Australian Army was not comfortable fighting at night in the Pacific at all, and tended to cede the night to the enemy. And this was throughout the entire Pacific War, and we are right at the start of that war. Also, he may not have been completely sure who held the bridge. There was some who thought that it might have been the Johor Military Force volunteers who had been on guard. But Farrell and Pratton put forward probably the most logical reason for that, and one of the diaries describes the troops at this point, at 0400 in the morning, that the troops were like zombies. They'd been in contact for days now, fighting in very arduous conditions, conducting a fighting withdrawal. So he may have just allowed the troops a couple of hours to grab some rest. And it was rest that they were going to sorely need, because as the sun rose on the 21st of January, it didn't provide them with any better tactical situation than they'd seen on the 20th. Anderson sent out a patrol to the edge of Parit Sulong. He then tried to storm the bridge with 3 companies from the 2nd 19th. They became embroiled with a battle with Japanese emerging from rubber trees on their left flank, which was defeated with the Bren gun carriers. And machine gun fire from buildings within the village were preventing the Australians from getting within 500 metres of the bridge. Ammunition was becoming low, particularly mortar ammunition. He moved his troops around at around 2100 in a flanking manoeuvre, and this was having some success. But the progress that he was making in the village wasn't happening quickly enough, because the critical battle was happening in the rear of the column. The perimeter was continuing to shrink, There was constant artillery bombardment and regular air attack. As night fell and the casualties mounted, the two regimental medical officers of the 2nd 19th and 2nd 29th urged Anderson to let them send 2 ambulances with the most seriously wounded forward. It was hoped that the Japanese would let them proceed on to Yongpeng for treatment. However, this was not to be the case. The Japanese held the 2 ambulances as hostages, and they demanded Anderson's surrender. Later in the evening, a wounded officer released the handbrakes in the ambulances, and they rolled down the steep ramp of the bridges, and they were able to escape. Now, under the cover of darkness, the Japanese attempted to mount a tank attack, with 6 tanks trying to get into the perimeter of the column. One was set on fire by one of the guns from the 65th Battery, and it cast the fire on the tank shed enough light so that tank hunting parties were able to destroy another 6 of the tanks. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and Anderson prepared a do-or-die assault for the following morning. Over a fading radio link, he was able to coordinate with divisional headquarters for an airstrike the following morning on the far side of the bridge, and also an airdrop of some urgently needed medical supplies. The reply came back, look up at Sparrow Fart. He was running out of mortar ammunition, and the 25-pounders had crest clearance problems with engaging targets in the village. There were hills in between where the guns were positioned and the targets on the far side of the bridge, so they weren't able to engage those targets. The next morning, 8 canisters were dropped on their position. They were able to recover 3 of them containing rations and medical supplies. He was able to get the medical supplies that he needed, but a lack of fighter coverage meant that there was no offensive air support on the far side of the bridge. He sent a company in to attack anyway, but fierce fire from the far side of the bank meant that they weren't able to take the bridge. As he described it, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was faced with a decision that any commander would be very loath to take. He had 3 options. He could fight it out to the destruction of his force, he could surrender, or he could abandon the transport and wounded and make out over the 20 kilometres of swamp with the remainder of his force to reach Yongpeng. At 0930, individual companies started to move away from the convoy, and most were able to get away with only very few casualties being experienced. 107 Australian and 35 Indian soldiers were massacred by the Japanese at Parit Sulong. There was only 3 survivors of the massacre. One of them, Lieutenant Ben Hackney, despite having one mangled leg and the other one broken, was kicked and jabbed with bayonets by the Japanese, but he feigned death and was left at Parit Sulong, dragging himself on elbows. He survived on food that he'd begged from villagers and drinking from water out of drains. He survived for 6 weeks in the jungle before being picked up by the Japanese, sent to Changi, from where he was sent to work on the Burma-Thai Railroad. He survived that and was able to give testimony about the massacre at Parit Sulong. The road junction at Yongpeng was becoming critical for the survival of West Force as it was to withdraw, and Bennett wouldn't trust the holding of the Yongpeng junction to anyone but the 27th Brigade, so he moved them up to seize that ground. In his diary, Bennett despaired at the potential loss of Anderson's column, but he did nothing to try and rescue it. Both Maxwell and Galligan pleaded to be able to send forward forces to try and rescue Anderson and his column, but Bennett did nothing. The 27th Brigade held the bridge over the Cannon River at Yongpeng. This was the only place that the survivors of Anderson's column could get back across Japanese lines. And the first troops arrived at around 1600 on the 23rd of January. Maxwell went forward himself to personally supervise the demolition of the bridge because he was concerned about the fate of his old battalion. Anderson and a group of 100 troops crossed it around midnight, and Maxwell delayed the demolition by another 3 hours to give the best possible chance for any stragglers to come across In total, 400 Indians and 500 Australians returned from the pitiable inferno at Parit Sulong. Anderson immediately reported to Bennett after arriving at Yong Pen. He was unwashed, hadn't slept or eaten, but Bennett noted in his diary how calm Anderson was, and that from this I understand why he was able to keep his men in hand, with such coolness, self-control, strength of character, and such kindly affection and consideration for his men, he could overcome all difficulties. With a few more leaders of his type, the Japanese would never have succeeded. Many survivors of that column stated that without Anderson, the entire column would have been lost. On February the 14th, 1942, he was awarded the VC, and he's the only Australian Lieutenant Colonel in World War II to receive the VC for gallantry under fire. The citation reads, "For setting a magnificent example of brave leadership, determination, and outstanding courage. He not only showed fighting qualities of a very high order, but throughout exposed himself to danger without any regard for his personal safety. He was so determined to see the success of the attempt to break out for his column that in one of the attacks, a company commander had to plead with him for him not to personally lead the assault himself. Despite the risks of losing the commander of the column, on numerous occasions he did personally lead attacks." Soon after this, he went to Singapore as the Allies withdrew across the causeway, and he was then hospitalised, and as a result, he missed the majority of the fighting following the Japanese landings on the 8th of February. As the situation became desperate, on the 13th of February, he discharged himself from hospital and returned to the 2nd 19th. By then, it was down to just 180 men from its authorised strength of 900, and he led them until they surrendered, or until the surrender was announced 2 days later. As a quick side note, Takuma Nishimura, he was the commander of the Imperial Guards Division. You might remember back at the start of our story, we talked about the assassination of the Prime Minister in 1932, the Japanese Prime Minister. So Nishimura was the presiding judge at the court-martial of army officers responsible for that assassination. The defendants all received light sentences, and he was apparently rewarded for this with command of the Imperial Guards Division. Following the fall of Singapore, he was given responsibility for the eastern half of the island, and this was during the period of the Citation Massacre, and we'll cover this in a later podcast when we look at Singapore. He did not have a good working relationship with General Yamashita, and at times he was viewed as being quite insulting, and as a result of that, the division was denied the Emperor's Victory Citation, and he was recalled to Japan and forced to retire in 1942. After the war, he faced a British military tribunal in Singapore for the events related to the Citation Massacre, and he was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 4 of those years in Singapore before being sent back to Tokyo to complete his sentence. However, as he was being repatriated, he was forcibly removed from a ship in Hong Kong by Australian military police and brought before an Australian military tribunal in Manus Island. He was charged with the events at the Parit Sulong Massacre, found guilty, and executed by hanging on the 11th of June 1951. Subsequently, there's been questions asked about the veracity of some of the evidence presented in that tribunal. For Anderson, though, as a POW, he continued to show the leadership qualities that had seen him decorated with the VC. After the war, he returned to farming. He served in the Country Party from 1949 to 1961, and he died on Remembrance Day in 1988. I think Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson VC provides an excellent example of both moral and physical courage. Not only did he work hard to prepare the 2nd 19th for the battles that they would face, he led from the front when required to, and he showed the moral courage when placed in an impossible situation with a wounded that he could not care for. By showing the moral courage that he did, he was able to get 900 of the troops in his column back to friendly lines, which is an amazing effort and something that I think that we can all learn from.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.